Eliza Whitmore dropped to her knees in the mud and pressed her hands into the cracked earth the same morning her neighbor's gardens turned black. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just whispered something to the ground the way a woman speaks to the only friend she has left. Nobody saw her do it. Nobody would have cared if they had. Because in Willow Creek, Kansas, Eliza Whitmore was nobody. She was the foolish wife who gathered weeds while real women grew real food. Until the day the weeds were all that was left. If this story moves something inside, you hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Because Eliza's story deserves to be heard by every woman who has ever been called foolish for knowing something others couldn't see. Now let's begin. The morning it began, Eliza Whitmore was already awake before the sun. She had been awake for hours, actually, sitting at the edge of her bed in the gray dark listening. Thomas hadn't noticed. He never did. He slept the way hard-working men sleep, heavy and dreamless, one arm thrown over his face, boots still on his feet from the night before. She could hear him breathing slow and steady beside her, and for a moment she just looked at him. That jaw, that neck weathered and brown from years under the Kansas sun. The way his chest rose and fell like something slow and reliable. She loved him. Lord, she loved him, but loving a man didn't mean you could make him hear what he wasn't ready to hear. Eliza rose without a sound and pulled her shawl around her shoulders. The floorboards were cold. She moved through the kitchen the way she always did before dawn, without lighting a lamp, knowing every inch of the room by feel and memory. She had lived in this house for 6 years. She knew where the floors creaked, which cabinet stuck, where the mice had chewed through the corner of the grain sack she still hadn't told Thomas about. She filled a tin cup with water from the pitcher on the shelf and stood at the window. Outside, the fields were quiet, not the good kind of quiet, not the soft, settled quiet of a summer night bleeding into morning. This was something different, something empty, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up slow, the kind that told you something was missing before your mind could figure out what. Eliza pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She had been feeling it for weeks now, something wrong in the land. Something moving beneath the surface of ordinary days, patient and unstoppable, the way a flood builds long before the river breaks its banks. She had tried to say something once, just once, 3 weeks ago at the Caldwell supper. Margaret Caldwell had organized the gathering. She organized everything in Willow Creek, from the church socials to the barn raisings, to the quiet cruelties that passed between women over quilt making and pie swapping. Margaret was the kind of woman who wore her authority like a Sunday dress, always pressed, always visible, impossible to ignore. Eliza had sat at the far end of the table the way she always did, close enough to be polite, far enough to breathe. The conversation was the usual: crop prices, the new family that had come in from Ohio, whether Reverend Price was going to finally fix the leak in the church roof before the fall rains. Eliza had waited for a pause. Then she said it quietly, almost to herself, almost hoping no one would hear. "I've been watching the birds move east. And the beetles along the south bank, they're feeding heavy. I think the fields might be in trouble before summer's end." There was a silence, and then Margaret Caldwell had laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh exactly. It was something worse than mean. It was the laugh of a woman who had already decided the speaker wasn't worth taking seriously, light, dismissive, almost fond, the way you might laugh at something a child said that didn't quite make sense. "Eliza, sweetheart," Margaret said, turning back to the other women with a small smile, "the day I take farming advice from a woman who spends her mornings picking dandelions is the day I start wearing my apron backwards." The table had laughed. Not everyone, not Sarah Miller, who had looked down at her plate with something uncomfortable in her eyes. Not old Dorothy Hatch, who had simply reached for another biscuit. But most of them, enough of them. Eliza had finished her supper without saying another word. On the ride home, Thomas had not spoken either. He stared at the road, his big hand steady on the reins, and she could feel him deciding not to bring it up. He did that, sometimes chose silence the way other men chose action, believing that if you didn't acknowledge a thing, it would resolve itself somehow. It was the only part of him she truly didn't understand. She had gone to bed that night with the quiet burning in her chest the way it always did when she swallowed something that needed to be said. And she had lain there in the dark thinking about what she knew. About the patterns she had been watching for weeks. About the way the land had been trying to tell her something in the only language it knew. But nobody was listening, and Eliza had learned, slowly and painfully over 6 years in Willow Creek, that there was no point in speaking to people who had already decided you were foolish. So she did what she always did. She went back to the creek. Every morning, in the hour before Thomas woke, before the sun had fully committed to the sky, Eliza walked the south bank of Willow Creek with her woven basket on her arm. She walked slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her to walk when she was small, not like you're going somewhere, but like you're paying attention. Like the ground itself has something to say if you're willing to be quiet enough to hear it. Her grandmother had been a remarkable woman, Marin Whitmore. Born in Pennsylvania, moved west at 17 with nothing but a trunk and a determination that scared people who didn't know what to do with strong women. She had learned plants from an old woman in the settlement, where she first lived, what could be eaten, what could heal, what could be dried and stored and turned into medicine, through a hard winter. She had passed that knowledge to Eliza, the way people pass down the things they believe matter most, slowly, carefully, with her hands on top of Eliza's hands in the dirt. The land has a memory, Marin used to say, her voice dry and certain as autumn. People forget the land doesn't. Eliza had grown up believing that. Thomas's family believed in something different. They believed in control. In straight rows and precise planting schedules. In seed catalogs and almanacs and the careful management of what the earth produced. His mother had been the same, a meticulous woman who prided herself on a kitchen garden so perfect it was like a room in her house, every plant in its proper place, nothing unplanned allowed. When Thomas married Eliza, he had expected something similar. What he got instead was a wife who spent her mornings beside a creek. He had never told her directly that it embarrassed him. He was too good a man for that, but she saw it in small ways, the way he changed the subject when neighbors asked what Eliza did with her time, the way he tensed almost imperceptibly whenever she brought something unusual to the table. The slight pause before he tasted things she had gathered instead of grown. She never said anything. There was no point. A person's pride was their own to manage. And she had learned long ago that trying to argue someone out of their embarrassment was like trying to argue them out of the color of their eyes. She just kept walking the creek. That morning, the morning everything began, she walked further than usual. She went past the familiar stretch where the watercress grew thick against the muddy bank, past the flat rocks where she usually rested, around the bend where the creek narrowed, and the cottonwoods grew close enough to make a kind of tunnel overhead. She went all the way to the east bank where the ground rose up into a little ridge overlooking the Miller farm on one side and the Caldwell property on the other. She stood there for a long time. Below her, the Caldwell fields were perfect. Margaret kept them that way obsessively, almost aggressively perfect. Every row aligned, every fence post straight, the whole operation running like a woman trying to prove something to a world that had spent too long telling her she wasn't enough. Eliza could actually respect that, even if she couldn't say so. But she saw it now, clear as anything, the color was wrong. Not all of it, not yet. But along the eastern edge where the Caldwell corn met the Miller corn in a shared fence line, there was a brownish tone at the edges of the leaves that didn't belong there in June. It was subtle. Anyone moving fast would miss it. Most people were always moving fast. Eliza was never moving fast. She crouched down on the ridge and pressed 2 fingers into the soil at her feet. The earth was dry in a way that went deeper than the surface. She pulled her fingers back and looked at them. She thought about the beetle casings she had seen scattered along the south bank 3 days ago. She thought about the unusual quiet in the bird population this past week. She thought about the specific combination of a dry spring and an easterly wind pattern, and the way certain insects multiplied in conditions that looked perfectly fine to the human eye, until they suddenly, catastrophically weren't. She stood up. She stood there for a long moment with the morning air moving around her and the sun beginning to find the tops of the cottonwoods, and she made a decision. She was going to try one more time, not at a supper table. Not in front of Margaret Caldwell. She was going to go to Thomas directly. She was going to tell him what she had seen, explain it as plainly as she could, and ask him not tell him, ask him to consider taking it seriously. She walked home with her basket still mostly empty, her mind turning things over. Thomas was up when she got back. She could smell coffee. He was sitting at the table with his hat on, and his boots already laced, the way he sat when he was thinking about the day ahead, already somewhere else in his mind even while his body was still in the kitchen. He looked up when she came in. Early walk, he said. Went further than usual. She set her basket on the counter and stood there for a moment, with her back to him, choosing words. Thomas, she said, I need you to listen to me. Really listen. Not the way you listen when you're thinking about something else. There was a pause behind her. She heard him set his cup down. Eliza, I mean it. She turned around. I've been watching something for weeks, and I didn't say it because of what happened at the Caldwell supper, and I know you know what I mean by that. But I'm saying it now, and I need you to hear it. He looked at her steadily. Thomas Whitaker was not a man who reacted quickly to things. He had a kind of deliberateness that could look like patience or stubbornness, depending on the situation. Right now it looked somewhere between the two. All right, he said. I'm listening. The fields are going to fail. Silence. The east fields especially, she said. The beetles are moving in from the south bank. The birds have been going east away for almost 2 weeks now. The soil along the ridge above the Miller place is drying from beneath, not from above, which means something underground is disrupted. I've seen this combination before in the accounts my grandmother kept. She documented a similar pattern in 1847 in Pennsylvania. The crops failed within a month. Thomas said nothing for a long moment. Eliza, I know what you're going to say. You don't know. You're going to say the almanac doesn't show anything unusual. You're going to say that Henry Caldwell walked those fields 2 days ago and didn't see a problem. You're going to say that I'm not a farmer and that I spend my time by the creek instead of the garden. And maybe I ought to spend more time with proper plants before I start making predictions about other people's. The words came out harder than she intended. She watched his jaw tighten. I wasn't going to say any of that, he said. But you were thinking it. I was going to say, he said, slow and careful, that even if you're right, what exactly are you asking me to do? Go to the neighbors and tell them their fields are going to fail based on what? Bird patterns. Beetles on the creek bank? He picked up his cup again. They'll think I've lost my mind. Or worse, they'll think you've lost yours and I'm just following along. I don't care what they think. I know you don't. His voice was quiet. Not unkind. That's always been the difference between us. She stared at him. Thomas, she said, very quietly, if I'm wrong, then nothing happens and we go on the same as before. But if I'm right, if you're right, he said, then we'll deal with it when the time comes. She turned back to the counter. She heard him stand, heard the scrape of the chair, heard his boots on the floor as he moved toward the door. He paused there. I do hear you, he said, and she could tell he meant it, in the limited way a man can mean something when he's already decided not to act on it. There's only so much a man can do, Eliza. He can't chase down every worry. The door opened and closed. Eliza stood at the counter with her hands flat on the wood and breathed. All right then, she had tried. She turned to her basket and pulled out what little she had collected that morning, a handful of wood sorrel, some clover heads, a few sprigs of something she had found near the ridge that she wanted to press and study more carefully. She laid them out on the counter with the careful attention she gave everything she gathered, taking her time, thinking about each plant, what it was and where it had come from, and what it could be used for. This was the part no one ever saw. Everyone in Willow Creek saw a woman picking weeds and assumed it was a quirk, an eccentricity, maybe even a kind of mental imbalance brought on by too much time alone. What they didn't see, what they never took the time to see, was the notebook on the shelf above the counter, filled with 6 years of careful observations in Eliza's small, precise handwriting. The sketches, the dates, the notes about which plants appeared in which conditions, which ones could be dried for winter, which ones produced reliably in dry years when garden plants failed, which ones the insects left alone. She had not built that knowledge to prove anything to anyone. She had built it because she was her grandmother's daughter, and her grandmother had taught her that knowledge was the only thing no one could take from you once you had it deep enough inside you. She worked quietly at the counter for a long time. Outside, the morning was warming toward full day. She could hear the distant sound of Thomas working somewhere on the far side of the property, the rhythmic thud of something being repaired or built, the ordinary sounds of a farm at work. She could hear the neighbor's rooster, a cart on the road, a woman's voice calling across a yard. Everything sounded normal. That was the thing about disaster. It sounded normal right up until it didn't. 10 days later they came, not one or two a wave. A moving, seething, impossible wave of beetles sweeping across the valley from the east like something out of the Old Testament, unstoppable and indifferent. Rising out of the dry soil and the long grass in numbers that made grown men stand in their fields with their hats in their hands and their mouths open, and nothing coming out. Eliza was at the creek when it started. She heard it before she saw it, a strange collective rustling, almost like rain but not like rain, coming from the direction of the Caldwell fields. She straightened up and turned, and she saw the black shimmer of it moving across the eastern edge of Margaret's corn. She stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up her basket and walked home. She did not run. Running would have meant panic, and Eliza did not panic. She had been preparing for this for weeks, methodically and quietly, the way she did everything, without announcing it, without asking permission, without needing anyone to believe her first in order to act. She had doubled her gathering over the past 10 days. The notebook on her shelf had 7 new pages of entries. The root cellar beneath the house held more than it had ever held in the fall, let alone the middle of summer. The shelves in the kitchen were full. Thomas was coming in from the far field when she reached the house. She could see it in his face the moment he saw her. He had seen it too. That controlled, deliberate composure of his was cracked slightly, a tightness around his eyes that wasn't usually there. He stopped in front of her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "How?" Eliza asked. His jaw worked. "Can't tell yet." "Moving fast. East side worst? How did you?" He stopped. A strange expression moved across his face. "Yes, east side worst." She nodded. She turned toward the house. "Eliza," he said behind her. She turned back. He was standing there in the afternoon light with his hat in his hand, and he looked not defeated. Thomas Whitaker was not a man who looked defeated easily. But he looked like a man who had just understood something he should have understood sooner, and was in the middle of deciding what to do with that understanding. "The creek plants," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. "The things you've been gathering." "Yes," she said. "We have enough for us?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "For others?" She looked at him steadily. "Depends." "On what?" "On whether people are willing to eat what I bring them." He held her gaze. "Make dinner," he said. It came out rough, like a man who was holding himself accountable for something and didn't have much practice at it. "I'll be in." She turned and went inside. The dinner she made that evening was the simplest and most honest thing she had ever put on their table. Wild greens she had gathered that morning, quickly blanched and seasoned. A soup from roots she had dried and stored, with some dried herbs that turned the broth dark and fragrant and warming. A flat bread she had made from a flour she had ground herself from dried seeds she had been collecting for months. Not fancy, not pretty, not what Thomas had grown up expecting food to look like. He sat down across from her at the table. He looked at it. She watched him look at it, watched him go through whatever private process a man goes through when he's confronting the distance between what he expected and what is. She didn't say anything. She had learned that saying something in those moments almost always made it worse. Then he picked up his spoon. He tasted the soup. He put the spoon down and was quiet for a moment. "This is good," he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not just the ordinary approval of a man complimenting his wife's cooking. Something underneath it. Something that sounded like the beginning of reckoning. "I know," she said. He looked up at her, and something passed between them across the table. Not words, not an apology, not a conversation. Just a recognition. The kind that happens between two people who have been living parallel to each other, and have just discovered, in the middle of a disaster, that they might actually be on the same side. He picked up his spoon again. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want to walk with you." She nodded once, all right. Outside, somewhere across the fields, a neighbor's voice carried on the evening air. Calling out, the sound of it strange and ragged in a way that told you everything, a man discovering that what he had trusted most was gone. The sound cut off, and then there was only the usual evening chorus of insects and wind, carrying on as if nothing had happened. Thomas and Eliza finished their dinner in silence. But it was a different kind of silence then, than the ones that had lived in this house before. The next morning, Thomas Whitaker woke before dawn for the first time in his adult life, and put on his boots in the dark without being asked, and went to stand beside his wife at the kitchen door, waiting. She looked at him when she came out with her basket. She didn't say a word about it. She just handed him a smaller basket and walked out, and he followed her into the gray morning air, down toward the creek bank, into the world she had been living in alone for 6 years. She walked the way she always walked, slow, attentive, her eyes moving across the ground, and the vegetation with a calm focus that had always looked to him like distraction or vagueness, something unfocused and impractical. He understood now that he had been wrong about what he was seeing. What she was doing required more attention than anything he did in a day. She was reading. She was reading the land the way he read the almanac, looking for patterns, checking signs, building a picture from 100 small details that added up to something real. "This one," she said, crouching beside a cluster of low plants growing at the edge of the water. "Watercress. You've seen this, you just didn't know what it was." "I know watercress," he said. "Do you know how to prepare it so it doesn't turn bitter?" He didn't say anything. "Blanch it first," she said. 30 seconds in boiling water. Drain it, cool it, then cook it the rest of the way. The bitterness leaves in the blanching. Most people who try it raw and hate it don't know that. She moved along the bank. "Wild garlic," she said, pointing to a cluster of long, thin leaves. "You can tell by the smell. Crush a leaf." She handed him one. He crushed it between his fingers and smelled it, and she was right, unmistakably garlic. The leaves, the bulbs, the flowers if it's bloomed. All edible, better than what you'd buy. She kept walking. Wood sorrel, see the 3-leaf shape like a small shamrock? Tart, almost lemony. Good raw or cooked. The children like it. You've given it to children? Sarah Miller's youngest has been eating it for 2 years. Her mother didn't know I was the one who showed her where to find it. She said it without accusation, simply as fact. She knew people would say something. Thomas was quiet for a while after that. They moved deeper along the creek, and she showed him more wild onion, lamb's quarters, purslane, a root she called yellow root that she used for medicinal purposes rather than eating. A kind of mint that grew in the shaded areas where the bank overhung the water. She showed him the patterns of what grew where and why. She explained the conditions that made certain plants thrive in drought, which ones the beetles avoided because of their chemistry, which ones produced heavily in years when cultivated plants struggled. She talked the way she walked, unhurried, precise, without any apparent desire to impress him. She was simply telling him things she knew, the way you told someone things when you were finally able to speak freely. He listened. He listened hard. Toward mid-morning they sat on the flat rocks further down the bank, and Eliza opened the basket and handed him a piece of the flatbread from the night before. He took it. He ate it slowly. "How long have you been preparing?" he asked. "Weeks. Since before the beetles came, yes." He looked at the water for a moment. "You knew I suspected. I had evidence. The difference matters." She looked at him directly. "I told you. You told me." He said it like a man agreeing to a charge. "I didn't listen, no." He turned the remaining bread in his hand. "Eliza I. Thomas," she said, and her voice was quiet but not soft exactly. The way a woman speaks when she's been patient a very long time and has decided not to waste what patience she has left on apologies. We'll deal with that later. Right now, there are people in this settlement who are going to be hungry by the end of the week. I need to know if you're going to help me or if I'm doing this alone." He looked at her. Something in his face settled. "I'm going to help you," he said. She nodded once. "Then finish your breakfast," she said. "We have a lot of ground to cover." They walked for another 2 hours. By the time they returned to the house, Thomas's smaller basket was full, and his boots were muddy, and his hat was pushed back on his head in the way it went when he had been thinking hard about something. He stood in the kitchen while Eliza sorted what they had gathered, watching her hands move with the same practiced efficiency he brought to his own work. "Sarah Miller," he said. "Her kids haven't eaten proper in 3 days. I saw her at the fence line yesterday. I know, should we go over?" "Yes," she said, "but Tomo," he set his jaw. "They might say no. They might say no," she said. "A lot of people are going to say no. They'd rather be hungry than admit they need help from." She stopped. "From you," he finished. "Yes." He stood there for a moment. Then he picked up the basket he'd carried all morning and moved it to the door without being asked. "Let them say it," he said. "We'll go anyway." And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eliza Whitmore looked at her husband and felt something ease inside her chest. Not because the crisis was over, it was just beginning. Not because the community was going to welcome her. Most of them wouldn't, not yet, not without going through everything they were about to go through first. But because she was no longer going to face it alone. She picked up her shawl. "All right then," she said. She walked to the door. Thomas held it open. They stepped out together into the ruined summer, and somewhere across the fields the beetles moved on. Sarah Miller's hands were shaking when she opened the door. Not from cold. It was the middle of summer, hot enough to make the air above the dirt road shimmer. Her hands were shaking the way hands shake. A person has been holding something heavy for too long, and the weight has finally moved from the arms into everything else. She looked at Eliza, then she looked at Thomas, then she looked at the basket. "She didn't say anything for a long moment, Sarah," Eliza said gently. "Can we come in?" Sarah Miller was 32 years old and looked 45. She had 4 children, a husband who had gone to Dodge City 3 months ago to look for work and sent 1 letter since, and a garden that as of yesterday morning was nothing but blackened stems and beetle casings and the particular silence of something that used to be alive. "I don't need charity," Sarah said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "It's not charity," Eliza said. "It's food, and I need someone to tell me honestly whether I've seasoned it right, because Thomas says I used too much salt and I think he's wrong." Thomas, to his credit, did not contradict her. He simply stood there with his hat in his hands, looking at the ground the way a man looks when he knows the women around him are handling something better than he could. Something moved behind Sarah's eyes, not quite a smile. But something. She stepped back from the door. They came in. The Miller house smelled like hunger. That was the only way to describe it. Not dirty, not neglected, just empty in a way that went beyond the visible. The kind of house where the cooking smell has been gone long enough that the absence of it has become its own presence. 3 of Sarah's children were sitting at the table when they walked in. The youngest, a girl of about 4 with her mother's dark eyes and a smear of something on her chin that wasn't food, looked up at the basket with an expression so open and unguarded it was almost unbearable to see. Eliza set the basket on the table without ceremony. "Soup first," she said. "I kept it warm. Hand me your pot, Sarah, and I'll show you how to stretch it so it feeds all of you through tomorrow." Sarah handed her the pot without a word, and that was the first door that opened in Willow Creek that summer. Thomas watched Eliza work in that small kitchen and felt something shifting in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. She moved through that unfamiliar space the way she moved through everything, like she had already figured out how it worked and was just doing what needed to be done. She showed Sarah how to thin the soup with creek water and wild onion without losing the flavor. She showed her the greens and how to blanch them. She explained it all clearly, practically, without any condescension, without any trace of "I told you so," though God knew she had the right. The youngest girl climbed off her chair and stood at Eliza's elbow, watching with the serious attention of a child who has learned that food is not something to take for granted. "What's that?" the child said, pointing to a bundle of watercress. "That's watercress," Eliza told her, crouching down to the child's level. "You want to smell it?" The girl smelled it, made a face, then reached for a piece. "It tastes better cooked," Eliza said, and the child didn't seem to care either way, because she chewed it thoroughly and then held out her hand for more. Sarah Miller watched from the other side of the kitchen. When she thought no one was looking, she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for just a moment. Thomas looked away, gave her the privacy of it. On the walk back to their own house that afternoon, he and Eliza didn't speak for a while. The road was quiet. The fields on either side of them were not the kind of quiet they had been the week before, that dangerous loaded silence. This was a different quiet, the quiet of things that had already happened. "Who's next?" Thomas asked. "Hatch family," Eliza said. "Dorothy's husband has bad knees and can't walk the property to see how bad it is. She doesn't know yet. And after that, the Pruitt boys on the north end." And then she paused. "Then we'll hit the wall." "What wall?" She looked at him sideways. "The wall where people would rather go hungry than be seen accepting help from me." He was quiet for a beat, the Caldwells, and everyone in Margaret's orbit. She said it without venom. Just flat factual, which is most of the settlement. Thomas put his hat back on and pulled it down a little lower. "Let me handle Margaret." Eliza stopped walking. He stopped too, turned to look at her. "Thomas," she said slowly, "the last time someone tried to handle Margaret Caldwell, the Hendersons ended up moving to Colorado." "I'm not the Hendersons." "No," she agreed, "but Margaret has a gift for making people feel like they're the problem, and I don't want you to go in there angry and give her something to use." He held her gaze. "Who said anything about angry?" She raised an eyebrow. He almost smiled. "I'll be civilized." "You'll be furious. I'll be furious and civilized." "I have a lot of practice." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and kept walking. "Fine, but I'm coming with you." "I wouldn't have it any other way." They visited Dorothy Hatch next. Dorothy was 81 years old and the kind of woman who had outlived enough disasters to view them with a philosophical calm that could read as either wisdom or exhaustion, depending on the day. When Eliza arrived with the basket, Dorothy looked at it, looked at Eliza, and said simply, "I've been eating your wood sorrel for 6 months. The rheumatism is better. I wasn't going to tell you, but since you're here—" Eliza blinked. "You knew?" "I knew that the young Miller woman told me about a plant that helped pain and told me she'd gotten the information from a reliable source. And I'm not a fool even if everyone thinks I am." Dorothy stepped back to let them in. "Come in. My coffee's terrible and I know it. You can have some anyway." Thomas sat at Dorothy Hatch's kitchen table and drank terrible coffee and felt for the first time in a long time like things might be survivable. The Pruitt situation was harder. The Pruitt boys were 2 brothers, Cal and James, in their 40s, big men who had broken their backs working land that barely gave anything back. Cal in particular had a face like a fist permanently closed, perpetually braced. When Thomas knocked on their door and explained what Eliza had to offer, Cal Pruitt looked at Eliza the way men look at things they don't understand and have already decided not to respect. "Creek plants," Cal said. "Yes," Eliza said. "My wife's going to eat creek plants." "If she wants to eat," Eliza said calmly, "yes." Cal stared at her. "You got some nerve, lady." "I've got some watercress," she said. "And some wild garlic. And enough lamb's quarters to make a decent meal for 6 people. You can stand here and argue with me about nerve, or you can go get your wife so I can show her how to prepare it." "Your choice, Mr. Pruitt. I'll wait either way." There was a long silence. Cal Pruitt's jaw moved. Then he turned and went back inside the house without another word. His wife appeared at the door 30 seconds later, practical and hungry and completely uninterested in her husband's pride. She looked at the basket. She looked at Eliza. "Show me," she said. Thomas had to work very hard not to laugh out loud. But the wall, when they reached it, was as solid as Eliza had predicted. It started the way most things in Willow Creek started, with Margaret Caldwell. 3 days after the Beatles came, the settlement had shifted into a kind of communal holding pattern. People were frightened but not yet desperate, managing on stored supplies that would last maybe another week, maybe 2 if they stretched carefully. Eliza had reached 9 families by then. Not all of them had accepted help. 2 families on the northern road had turned her away with tight smiles, and the particular stiffness of people who believe their suffering is preferable to their humiliation. But 9 families was 9 families, and the change was perceptible. People were talking, and because people were talking, Margaret Caldwell had started listening. Eliza was at the creek early Thursday morning when she heard footsteps behind her that were too deliberate, too measured to be Thomas or anyone she had already spoken to. She turned without hurrying. Margaret Caldwell stood on the bank above her, wearing a dress that was immaculate even in a crisis, her dark hair pinned precisely. Her hands folded in front of her like a woman who has thought carefully about how she wants to appear before she appears. Eliza waited. "People are talking about you," Margaret said. "People have always talked about me. Different now." Margaret picked her way down the bank slope with obvious care for her dress, which was either vanity or armor, and Eliza suspected it was both. "They're saying you saw this coming. I said it at your supper table," Eliza said. You laughed, not a flinch. Margaret Caldwell did not flinch. She had too much control for that, but something shifted in her eyes, a slight contraction, the tiniest adjustment, like a door that had been open half an inch pulling itself quietly closed. "I didn't think you were serious," Margaret said. "I was entirely serious." "You were talking about bird patterns and beetles." "Yes, it sounded—" Margaret paused, selected her word. "Eccentric, it was accurate," Eliza said. Another pause as. "Longer this time." Eliza turned back to the creek and went on with her gathering. She didn't walk away, but she didn't perform patience either. She simply did what she was there to do, and let Margaret decide what she wanted to do with herself. "What are you going to do?" Margaret said after a moment. "With what you find here?" "Feed people." "Which people?" "Anyone who asks." Eliza straightened and looked at her directly. "Including you, Margaret, if you get to a point where you need it." The expression on Margaret Caldwell's face was something Eliza had never seen there before. Not quite fear, not quite pride. Something complicated and raw, the look of a woman who has organized her entire identity around being the one who gives rather than receives, who leads rather than follows, who knows rather than learns. Standing in front of evidence that she has been wrong about something foundational. It lasted only a moment. Then it was gone, replaced by something composed and careful. "Henry's looking into purchasing additional supplies from Dodge City," Margaret said, as if this were relevant. As if it were an answer. "That's sensible," Eliza said. "We're not in need of Margaret." Eliza's voice was quiet. Firm. "You don't have to explain yourself to me. You're going to do what you're going to do, and if you need me, you know where I am." She paused. "I'm at the creek every morning. I've been here every morning for 6 years." "You knew that already." Margaret looked at her. Something moved in her face that she did not allow to become anything visible. She turned and walked back up the bank and across the field toward her own house, her back straight, her dress unmuddied despite everything. And Eliza watched her go and felt the complicated weight of dealing with a person who was both genuinely formidable and genuinely wrong, and the way that combination never got easier, no matter how many times you encountered it. She went back to gathering. Thomas was waiting when she got home. "How'd it go with Margaret?" he said, because he had seen Margaret on the bank from the kitchen window and had apparently been watching. "She came to look," Eliza said, setting her basket on the counter. "She's not ready yet, but she came. She came." Eliza began sorting through what she had gathered. "That's something." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then Eliza, "There's something you need to know." She turned. His face was doing the thing it did when he knew something he wished he didn't. The jaw tension, the eyes that were steady but working. "Cal Pruitt was at Henson's store this morning. Talking." He paused. "He's saying you charged his wife for the food." The room went very still. "I beg your pardon," Eliza said. "He's saying you made her pay." that you're profiting from the situation. Thomas held up a hand before she could speak. I know it's not true, but he's saying it, and people who want to believe it are going to believe it. Eliza set down the plant she was holding. She stood very still for a moment. She thought about Cal Pruitt's face on the doorstep. The way he had looked at her. The way his wife had come to the door and said, "Show me," with such simple hunger. She thought about the afternoon she had spent in that kitchen, showing a woman she had never been particularly close to how to prepare food that would carry her family through days that looked impossible. She thought about what it cost a man like Cal Pruitt to watch his wife need something he couldn't provide. And she thought about the particular cruelty of men who, when they cannot afford pride for themselves, take it out on the people who tried to help them. How many people has he told? She said. Enough. She picked up the plant again, set it in the sorting pile. Picked up another one. Eliza, I'm not going to stop, Thomas. I know you're not. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know. I just thought you should know. She worked in silence for a while. The sorting was methodical, something she could do with her hands, while the rest of her processed the shape of the thing that had just been described to her. Not surprised she was not surprised. Not truly, because she had lived in Willow Creek long enough to know how quickly fear became accusation in a small settlement, and how much easier it was to make the helper the villain than to sit with the discomfort of needing help. The Hendersons moved to Colorado, she said finally, not looking up from the counter. Yes, because when people got frightened enough and needed someone to blame, they chose the person who was already strange to them. She paused. I've thought about that. I've thought about it more than once this week. Thomas said nothing. He came and stood beside her at the counter, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and that was enough. And he knew it was enough. And that knowledge between them was one of the things she loved most about him. Are we going to be the Hendersons? He asked quietly. She considered it. Seriously considered it, the way she considered everything. No, she said, because the Hendersons left when people started to doubt them. We're going to stay while they're doubting us, and we're going to keep going, and eventually they're going to have to deal with the fact that we were right all along. She looked up at him. It's not comfortable, but it's the only way it works. He looked at her for a long moment. You've always known that, haven't you? Yes, even when I wasn't making it easier, even then. He didn't apologize again. She didn't need him to. But he put his hand over hers on the counter, briefly, firmly, the gesture of a man who is saying something that doesn't have words yet, and she turned her hand over and held his for just a moment before going back to the sorting. The lie spread faster than the food. By Friday, 7 more families had heard the version where Eliza charged for what she gave. By Saturday, a modified version had added that she was giving out plants that weren't safe to eat. Nobody sourced this version. It had no origin anyone could point to. It had simply arrived, the way bad stories arrive in small communities, seemingly from everywhere at once. On Sunday morning, a woman named Vera Langston came to Eliza's door and returned a bundle of dried greens Eliza had left with her on Thursday. She wouldn't meet Eliza's eyes. I'm sorry, Vera said to a spot just past Eliza's left shoulder. Henry says we can't. She stopped. Try it again. I'm sorry. She left. Eliza stood in the doorway holding the returned bundle and watching Vera's back as she walked away, and she was so still that a sparrow landed on the fence post 3 feet from her before it noticed her and startled away. Thomas appeared behind her. He saw the bundle. I'll go talk to Henry Langston, he said, and his voice had gone to that particular quiet that in Thomas Whitaker meant something was about to become very direct and possibly uncomfortable. Don't, Eliza said. Eliza, don't. She turned back inside. You'll make it worse. He's already embarrassed. Embarrassed men who get confronted become angry men, and angry men in a community this size do a lot of damage. She set the bundle back on the counter. It could still be used. Nothing was wasted. Let it go. How do you do that? He said, and she could hear genuine bewilderment in it. How do you just let it go? She thought about it for a moment. Because holding on to it would cost me more than they're worth, she said. And I've got work to do. She picked up her basket and went to the creek. But that evening, The thing that changed everything happened in a way she hadn't expected. James Whitfield, not Samuel, his grandson. A boy of 14 who went by Jamie and was constantly underfoot in that useful way that smart 14-year-old boys came running to their house at 7:30 with his hat in his hand and his face gone strange. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, out of breath at the door. "My grandfather wants to see you." Samuel Whitfield was 80 years old and had been farming the same land for 53 of them. He had the kind of authority that came not from any position or title, but from outlasting enough disasters to have earned the right to be listened to. People in Willow Creek talked about what Samuel Whitfield thought the way people talked about weather as a fact of the environment that affected everything. He was also sick, not the kind of sick that had been going around, not the seasonal illness that had been moving through some of the families, the one that had already affected several of the children this week, with fevers and stomach complaints. Samuel Whitfield had the kind of sick that came from age and exhaustion, and a body that had been working too hard for too many decades, and was beginning, very quietly, to stop cooperating. He was in bed when Eliza arrived, which told her more than anything else could have, because Samuel Whitfield was a man who got out of bed every morning, regardless of what his body was doing. And the fact that he was not out of bed meant something significant. Jamie stood in the doorway. Eliza sat down beside the bed. Samuel looked at her with eyes that were sharp and alive, even in a face that had gone papery and tired. "You're the Whitmore woman," he said, "the one who knows the creek plants." "Yes, sir, people are saying things about you, I know." "Stupid things," he said it flatly, without drama. "I've been watching you from this window for 3 years. You walk that creek every morning. You know what you're doing." He paused to gather breath. "I want to know what you know, about the plants, about what's edible, what's medicinal, what I should be growing for myself instead of waiting for." Eliza looked at him carefully. "Mr. Whitfield, are you asking me to teach you?" "I'm 80 years old," he said. "I'm too old to be taught. But I'm willing to listen if you're willing to talk." Something in her chest shifted, something warm and specific. "I'm willing to talk," she said. She talked for 2 hours. She brought out the notebook eventually, the one from her kitchen shelf, and laid it open across his quilt, and walked him through 6 years of entries, the dates, the observations, the patterns, the plant sketches she had made in pencil with notes on preparation and storage and medicinal use. He asked questions, good questions. The kind that told her he was following everything, building a framework in his mind, cross-referencing what she said against his own 5 decades of watching the land. At one point he said, "My wife knew some of this. She used to gather along the creek when we first settled." "What happened?" "People started saying it looked poor," he said. "Like we couldn't afford a proper garden." She stopped, a pause. "She always said she missed it." Eliza sat with that for a moment. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "would you be willing to tell people what we've talked about, not endorsing me specifically, just the knowledge? The plants, the practicality of it." He looked at her with those sharp old eyes. "You think my saying it will change things. I think it will change more things than me saying it." He was quiet. "Then you're probably right. That's not fair." "No, but it's true." Another pause. He reached out and tapped the notebook. "Leave this with me tonight, of course." She stood to go. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. She turned. "I've watched a lot of people in this settlement," he said. "Over a lot of years. I've watched people who were right and got ignored, and I've watched people who were wrong and got followed. It's not a fair system." He met her eyes. "But I want you to know that I am paying attention. And I am not the only one." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Good night, Mr. Whitfield." She walked home in the dark. She walked fast, because the emotion of the evening was pressing against the inside of her chest, and she needed the physical effort of moving to hold herself together. And she was not going to cry on the road, because someone had finally listened. She was not going to do that, except that when she got home and walked through the kitchen door, and Thomas looked up from the table with his coffee going cold in his hand, something in her face told him everything, and he stood up and came to her. And she pressed her forehead against his shoulder for exactly 30 seconds. Then she stepped back, straightened, picked up her shawl off the chair. "Samuel Whitfield wants to speak for us at the community meeting Monday," she said. Thomas stared at her. "You're serious? He's going to tell them what I know is real. He's going to back it up with his own experience." She sat down. "It'll be the first time anyone in this settlement has done that publicly." Thomas sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, turning things over. "Margaret's going to be there. Yes, she's not going to like it. No, and Cal Pruitt. Yes, and the families who returned the food. Yes." Eliza looked at him steadily. "All of them. And they're going to have to sit there and listen to the man they trust most in this valley tell them that what they decided about me was wrong." She paused. "I don't expect apologies. I don't expect it to be clean or easy. I expect it to be uncomfortable and messy, and that some people are going to leave that meeting still angry at me because it's easier than being angry at themselves." Another pause. "But it's going to happen." Thomas looked at her. "And you're going to be there," he said. "Of course I'm going to be there, and if it goes badly." "Then it goes badly," she said simply. "Thomas, I have been managing the way it going badly feels for 6 years. I can manage it one more time." She reached across and touched his hand briefly. "But I don't think it's going to go badly." He turned his hand over and held hers. Outside, the summer night moved around their house, and somewhere not far off, a family that had been hungry for 4 days was eating a soup made from creek plants and wild garlic, and the particular kind of abundance that only becomes visible when you have stopped looking for what you expected and started seeing what was actually there. The meeting was in 2 days, and Eliza Whitmore, for the first time in a very long time, was not dreading being seen. The Monday meeting was held in the back room of Henson's store, which was the largest indoor space in Willow Creek that wasn't a barn, and by 7 in the evening it was standing room only. Eliza had not expected that. She had expected maybe 20 people. The families she had helped, a few of the older residents who tended toward fairness, maybe some of the younger couples who hadn't yet calcified into the social positions that made changing your mind feel like losing a war. What she had not expected was the entirety of Willow Creek pressed into that low-ceilinged room with the smell of sawdust and dried goods and 50 people's anxiety mixing into something almost physical. Thomas felt her pause at the door. He put his hand at the small of her back. Not pushing, just present, she walked in. The room shifted when she entered. Not dramatically, not the way rooms shift in stories when the hero arrives. It was subtler than that, a few heads turning, a few conversations stopping mid-sentence. The particular quality of attention that a community gives to the person at the center of its current argument. She found 2 empty chairs near the middle and sat down. Thomas sat beside her. She kept her face neutral and her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead. Samuel Whitfield was already there, seated at the front on a wooden chair someone had brought specifically for him. He sat upright despite everything, his gnarled hands resting on his knees, his presence in the room doing the thing it always did, organizing the space around him without any apparent effort. Margaret Caldwell was in the 3rd row, center seat. Of course, Cal Pruitt was near the back with his arms crossed. His wife, Eliza noticed, was sitting 2 seats away from him with the particular posture of a woman who has made a decision about distance. The meeting was called to order by Robert Henson, who owned the store and was a decent man primarily because he was too busy to be anything else. He laid out the situation plainly: the crops, the losses, the supplies, what could be sourced from Dodge City and at what cost, what the realistic timeline was for recovery. It was a grim accounting. The room was very quiet during it, the kind of quiet that happens when numbers are being said out loud that everyone already knew but had been hoping to hear differently. Then Robert said Samuel wanted to say a few words. Samuel Whitfield stood up. The room waited. He spoke for 11 minutes. Eliza counted, not because the time mattered, but because her mind needed something to hold on to while he talked, and the room around her shifted in real time. He did not build to it or soften it. He was 80 years old and had no patience left for soft approaches. He said that he had spent 2 evenings with Eliza Whitmore and her knowledge of the creek plants and what grew on this land without anyone tending it. and that the knowledge Sheeta carried was the most practically useful thing he had encountered in the past decade of farming, and that he had confirmed with his own experience and his own memory that everything she had told him was accurate. He said that the things being said about her were false. He said that specifically, not that rumors were circulating, or that there had been some misunderstanding. He said the things being said about Eliza Whitmore were false, and that the people saying them ought to have better things to do with the time they had left before winter. He said that he had eaten from her table and was not dead, and that in his estimation this was sufficient evidence for any person with working senses. Then he sat down. The room was absolutely silent for about 3 seconds. Then it exploded, not into anger, or not only into anger, into the complicated release of a community that had been holding a very uncomfortable position and had just been given permission to shift it. People talking at once, turning to each other, the sound rising and then pulling back and then rising again. Eliza sat very still. Thomas leaned over and said quietly, close to her ear, "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and she was, which surprised her a little. She had expected to feel something enormous in this moment, vindication, relief, some great emotional wave. Instead, she felt something quieter, something that was almost just tiredness. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been right for a long time and is only now beginning to be believed, and has found that belief, when it finally comes, feels less like triumph and more like the slow release of a tension she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. Margaret Caldwell stood up. The room got quiet again, because Margaret standing up in a public meeting always meant something. "I have a question," Margaret said, and her voice was controlled, precise, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this. "For Mrs. Whitmore." Eliza looked at her. "The boy," Margaret said. "Tommy Harlan. He's been sick 4 days. His mother is saying he ate greens he found near the creek, and that's what made him ill." Every eye in the room turned to Eliza. She felt Thomas go very still beside her. "I haven't given Tommy Harlan anything," Eliza said clearly. "I've never spoken to Clara Harlan about the plants." "But he found them near the creek," Margaret just said. "Which is where you go. The creek bank is 50 yards long, Margaret. Half the settlement walks it. People are worried," Margaret said, and her voice shifted just slightly, not toward softness, but towards something that was performing concern while doing something else entirely. "There's a sick child, and there's a woman going around handing out plants nobody can identify, and people have a right to be concerned." "He identified them," said a voice from the side of the room. Everyone turned. It was Sarah Miller. She was standing up, which clearly surprised her as much as it surprised anyone else, because she had the expression of a woman who had made a decision faster than her composure could keep up with. "Tommy Harlan picked what he thought was wild garlic," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly but holding. "But it was crow garlic, which looks similar to someone who doesn't know the difference. Mrs. Whitmore taught me the difference 3 days ago. She specifically said to check the smell and the stem, and she specifically said that crow garlic was one of the ones to be careful about." She paused. If Clara Harlan had come to Eliza before letting her boy eat what he found, he'd be fine right now. Silence. Margaret's expression didn't change. That was the thing about Margaret, she had extraordinary control over her face. But her hands, Eliza noticed, had moved slightly, a barely perceptible tightening. "So you're saying," Margaret said carefully, "that the child's illness is the mother's fault?" "I'm saying," Sarah said, steadier now, "that knowledge prevents accidents. And we've been refusing the knowledge." The room shifted again. Eliza could feel it, that collective, almost physical process of a community reconsidering something. It didn't happen cleanly or all at once. It happened the way water changes temperature, gradually, invisibly, until suddenly it's different than it was. Cal Pruitt uncrossed his arms. Eliza noticed that. She noticed it because in 3 days of watching this situation develop, Cal Pruitt's crossed arms had been as reliable as a wall, and the fact that they had just moved meant something even if she didn't know yet what. Robert Henson cleared his throat. "Is there anything else on the Tommy Harlan matter that needs to be addressed tonight?" Silence. "All right." He looked at Eliza. Mrs. Whitmore, I think a fair number of folks here are wondering if you'd be willing to keep doing what you've been doing. Teaching, sharing what you know. Eliza looked at him steadily. That depends on whether people want to learn or just want food, she said it calmly, without accusation. Because I can give people food for a week, and it helps them for a week. But if they want to understand what I know and why I know it, they can help themselves and their families for years. I'll do either, but I want to be clear about which we're choosing. Robert Henson looked around the room. Show of hands. Who wants to learn? It was not unanimous. There were maybe 8 people who kept their hands in their laps, and Eliza noted their faces without judgment, because forcing knowledge on people was no better than withholding it. But there were more than 30 hands in the air, including, after a very long pause that everyone in the room noticed, Cal Pruitt's. His wife, 2 seats away, looked at him with an expression so layered that Eliza looked away from it to give her the privacy of it. Margaret Caldwell did not raise her hand, but she also did not leave the room. And that, Eliza had learned, was sometimes the most meaningful thing a person like Margaret could do. The meeting broke up 40 minutes later, and the room took a long time to clear because people kept stopping, some of them coming to where Eliza sat, some of them hanging back and then coming anyway, when enough other people had moved first. The social machinery of a small settlement working the way it always did, nobody wanting to be first, everybody watching to see who was going to be first so they could follow. Dorothy Hatch came first, because Dorothy Hatch was 81 years old, and had stopped caring about social order sometime around 1870. She put a hand on Eliza's arm and said, "Well done," which from Dorothy meant approximately the same as a standing ovation from anyone else. Sarah Miller came and stood in front of Eliza, with her hands twisted together, and said, "I should have said something sooner. As supper table when you first brought it up. I knew you were right, I could feel it, she stopped. You had children to protect," Eliza said, "and saying something would have cost you." That's not an excuse. No, but it's a reason, Eliza looked at her. You said it tonight, that's what matters. Sarah's face crumpled for just a moment. She pressed her lips together and held it together by force of will, the way mothers hold things together, and then she nodded and stepped aside to let the next person through. And there was a next person, and then another, and Thomas stood slightly behind Eliza and to the left, not inserting himself, just there, and she could feel him there, and it steadied her. Then the room was almost empty, and the person still standing near the back was Cal Pruitt. His wife had gone ahead. It was just him, standing near the door with his hat in his hands, not the crossed arms posture of before, but the posture of a man who has something to say and is not sure how to begin. Eliza waited. He walked over, stopped in front of her. I said something that wasn't true, Cal Pruitt said. His voice was flat and effortful, the voice of a man to whom this kind of statement was genuinely physically difficult. About you charging. I said it and it got around and it wasn't true. I know, Eliza said. He stopped, embarrassed, she said, not cruelly. Just naming it. He didn't deny it. My wife needed help and I couldn't help her, and you could, another stop. His jaw worked. Mr. Pruitt, Eliza said, and her voice was as steady as she could make it. You have a family that's going to need to eat through the rest of the summer, and most of fall, before the fields recover. Your wife knows where to find me, so do you, she paused. That's enough. We don't need to say anything else about the other. He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded once, put his hat on and walked out. Thomas waited until the door closed. That's as close to an apology as Cal Pruitt has ever given in his life, he said. I know, and you just enough. She gathered her shawl. Yes. Thomas looked at her with something in his expression that wasn't new exactly, but was more visible than it usually got, the particular regard of a man who has been married to someone for years and keeps discovering, at intervals, that the person is deeper than he has been seeing. You know what you are, he said. I'm sure you're going to tell me. You're the most stubborn, generous person I've ever met in my life. She almost smiled. That's not the compliment you think it is. It's the best one I've got, he said. She picked up her basket. Come on, we've got an early morning. They were almost at the door when it happened. The thing that knocked the breath out of her. Margaret Caldwell was standing just outside, near the step, as if she had been waiting. She was alone. The composed posture was still there, spine straight, chin level, but something underneath it had changed in a way that was hard to name. Like a house where all the furniture is in its usual place, but the foundation has shifted slightly. Eliza stopped. Margaret looked at her. She didn't look at Thomas, which was notable, because Margaret always acknowledged the men in a room first. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "Mrs. Caldwell," a pause. The evening air between them was warm and still. "The thing I said at the supper table," Margaret said. 3 weeks ago. Eliza waited. Margaret started. Stopped. Something in her face tightened, not against emotion exactly, but against the specific vulnerability of saying something you can't take back once it's said. "I want you to know that it was not an accurate assessment of your value or your knowledge. And I said it in front of people, which made it worse than if I had simply thought it privately." Eliza looked at her for a long moment. This was not an apology. Not quite. It was a very Margaret Caldwell version of one precise, controlled, carefully stripped of anything that could be characterized as weakness. But it was real. It was as real as a woman like Margaret could be in a space like this, standing on a store step at night with the community still filtering out around them. "Thank you," Eliza said. Margaret gave a single nod. "I'd like to be included," she said, "in the teaching." "Whatever you're organizing." Eliza absorbed that. "Wednesday morning," she said. Creek Bank, South Side, just past the Flat Rocks. 7 o'clock. Bring practical boots. Something in Margaret's face shifted. Not a smile. Margaret Caldwell didn't smile in moments like this. But something adjacent to relief. The expression of a person who made a long walk and arrived. "I'll be there," she said. She walked back toward the road. Eliza watched her go. Thomas stood beside her. "Did Margaret Caldwell just ask to be one of your students?" he said. "She did. The woman who laughed at you in front of her supper table." "Yes," he let out a breath. "Lord. They walked home in the dark, and Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in the entire lead-up to ice night. All the worry and the preparation and the lying awake and the conversations that had cost her, she felt something loosen. Not everything. Not the memory of what had been sitted, or the months of isolation, or the particular loneliness of being consistently dismissed by people you shared a community with. That didn't dissolve in a single evening. That wasn't how pain worked. But something loosened. And Thomas, walking beside her, seemed to feel it too, because after a while he took her hand the way he hadn't taken it, just walking since early in their marriage, and they walked the rest of the way home like that, not saying much, not needing to. But the thing Eliza didn't know yet, the thing that was waiting for her like a stone in the road, was that the meeting had settled one problem and created another. Because Tommy Harlan was not getting better. She found out the next morning when Jamie Whitfield appeared at her door before 6, out of breath, his face pale. "Mrs. Whitmore, Clara Harlan sent me. Tommy's worse." Eliza was already reaching for her coat. "How much worse?" She said he can't keep water down. He's been sick all night. Thomas was at the table with his coffee. He looked up. "Go," he said. She went. Clara Harlan was a woman she knew slightly not well, because Clara moved in Margaret's circle and Eliza moved in her own orbit that intersected it rarely. She was a small woman, bird-boned, with the permanently worried expression of a mother who has learned that the world is more dangerous than she was told it would be. She met Eliza at the door of her house with red eyes and a kind of desperate composure that was worse to see than outright crying. "I didn't know," Clara said immediately. "I want you to know I didn't know he'd gone out. He went by himself. He said he'd seen you at the creek, and he wanted to find what you found, and I didn't." Eliza's voice was calm, firm. "Tell me exactly what he ate and how much." Clara told her. Eliza listened carefully. Crow garlic in significant quantity, from what she could piece together. Tommy was 8 years old and weighed about 60 pounds and had eaten enough of it to produce genuine symptoms. It wasn't fatal. Crow garlic wasn't toxic at this level, not in a healthy child, but it was miserable, and the dehydration from the repeated vomiting was becoming the actual concern. She went in to see the boy. He was in the small bedroom at the back of the house, lying on his side in the bed, and he was pale and small and very still except for the occasional shiver that moved through him. He looked up at her when she came in, 8 years old with big dark eyes and the look of a child who is sick enough to be scared. "Hi," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I'm Mrs. Whitmore. I know you've heard about me. You're the Creek lady," he said. His voice was thin. "I am." She put the back of her hand against his forehead. "Hot. Did you know that crow garlic and wild garlic look almost identical if you don't know what to check?" "I didn't know," he said. "Of course you didn't. That's why I'm going to teach you when you're well." She looked at him steadily. "And you will be well. This is unpleasant, but it isn't dangerous. What your body is doing is exactly what it should do, trying to get rid of something that doesn't agree with it. The problem right now is that you need to keep water in you, and your stomach doesn't want to cooperate." He looked at her with the focused attention of a sick child listening to an adult who sounds like they know what they're talking about. "I have something that can help with that," she said. "It tastes terrible. Significantly. Worse than being sick, different than being sick. Less undignified," she almost smiled. He thought about it. "Deal." She went back to the kitchen, where Clara was standing with her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from. "Ginger root," Eliza said. "Do you have any dried ginger? Or peppermint, either works." "I think so. In the back of the pantry, find it. And then I'm going to show you how to make a tea that will calm his stomach enough to keep water down. And then I'm going to show you how to keep him hydrated through the next 12 hours. And by tomorrow morning, he's going to be miserable but stable. And within 3 days, he'll be running around like nothing happened." Clara stared at her. "Why are you helping us?" she said, and her voice broke on the last word. "After what people have been saying."
"Because he's a child who's sick,"
Eliza said simply. "There's no because beyond that." Clara pressed her hand to her mouth. Eliza found the ginger herself because Clara's hands were shaking too badly to manage the pantry efficiently, and she made the tea and showed Clara every step, talking through it in the same practical, patient way she taught everything. And then she sat with them for 2 hours while Tommy kept the first small cup down, and then another, small quantities, slow and steady. By the time she left, the color had come back slightly into the boy's face. By the time she reached home, the thing she hadn't anticipated had already happened. Because in a small settlement, news moves at the speed of someone walking fast between houses, and what had moved through Willow Creek in the 4 hours she'd been at the Harlan house was not the version she would have written. The version that had moved was this: Tommy Harlan had gotten sick from Eliza Whitmore's plants, and Eliza Whitmore had gone to the house to manage what she'd done. That was the version Margaret Caldwell heard, and Margaret, who had stood on a store step the night before, and said something as close to an apology as she had ever managed Margaret, who had asked to come to the creek on Wednesday, was confronted with this version by 3 separate people before noon, and she did the thing that people do. When their new conviction collides with a louder story, she hesitated. Eliza didn't know any of this until Wednesday morning. She arrived at the creek at 10 to 7. She had her basket, her notebook, her practical boots as she'd told the group to bring. She had prepared for this morning carefully what she would show them first, how she would structure it, how she would manage the mix of people she expected, some of them genuinely curious and some of them still navigating pride. 6 people arrived: Sarah Miller, Dorothy Hatch, Cal Pruitt's wife, whose name was Ruth and who arrived with her own basket and a look of settled determination. 2 younger women Eliza knew only slightly, and Jamie Whitfield, who was there on behalf of his grandfather and carrying a notebook of his own. Margaret Caldwell did not come. Eliza did not let herself react to that in front of the group. She started the lesson. She started it the same way she would have started it if everyone she expected had shown up, because the people who were there deserved the full version, and she was not going to deliver a lesser thing because someone had failed to appear. She walked them along the creek and showed them plants and explained identification and preparation and storage, and she answered questions carefully and specifically, and the morning was, despite everything, genuinely good. Ruth Pruitt turned out to have an excellent eye, and a practical intelligence that Eliza immediately respected. Young Jamie asked questions that would have done credit to someone twice his age. Even Dorothy, who claimed to know everything already, learned 3 things and admitted to 2 of them. But the absence sat in Eliza's chest like a stone the entire time. It was Ruth who told her, on the walk back, speaking carefully and with the specific gentleness of a woman breaking news she wishes she didn't have to break. "Margaret heard about the Harlan boy," Ruth said. "Someone told her you caused it and then went to cover your tracks." Eliza stopped walking. Ruth stopped with her. "She doesn't necessarily believe it," Ruth said. A pause. She went back to saying nothing, which for Margaret is the same as retreating. Eliza stood there in the middle of the path with the morning light coming through the trees and 6 days of hard-won ground dissolving under her feet, and she felt the specific, devastating exhaustion of a person who has fought for something real and watched it get dismantled by a story that isn't true. She breathed again. "Who told her?" she said. Ruth hesitated. "Who?" Ruth said quietly. "He heard the wrong version first. Before I could, he'd already said it to 2 people. By the time I told him what actually happened, it had already gotten to Margaret through the Hendersons." She looked at Eliza with genuine pain. "He doesn't know he passed it on wrong. He was just talking, and he didn't know." Eliza looked at the ground for a moment. This was the thing about small communities. You could do everything right. You could go to the sick child and help. You could show up at the meeting and stand your ground. You could accept the near apology on the store step with grace. And then one wrong version of one story could unspool 10 days of careful work before you had a chance to catch it. She thought about Thomas, about what he would say. He would say, "Let me go talk to Cal." He would say, "Let me straighten this out." And she understood the impulse. She did. But she also knew from 6 years of evidence that there was only one way this kind of thing got corrected. Not through someone defending her. Through the truth showing up in person. She turned around and walked back up the path. "Eliza," Ruth called after her, surprised. "Go home," Eliza called back. "Take care of your family." "I'll see you Friday." She walked directly to the Harlan house. Clara opened the door on the first knock, and behind her, visible through the front room, Tommy Harlan was sitting at the table with a piece of bread in his hand, his color back, his eyes bright. Very clearly not the child who had been lying in a dim room unable to keep water down yesterday morning. Eliza looked at him. He looked at her and grinned, which was so purely 8 years old and irrepressible that something in her chest hurt with relief. "Still alive," he announced. "I can see that," she said. She turned to Clara. "I need you to do something for me." "Anything," Clara said, and she meant it absolutely. "I need you to go to Margaret Caldwell's house and tell her what happened. Not what someone else told her, what actually happened. I need you to tell her that I came here to help your son, and that I did help your son, and that the plants he ate were not from me, and were not from anything I gave you." Clara stared at her. "You want me to go to Margaret?" "Yes, she'll ask me a dozen questions, answer them." She can be, Clara searched for the word, intimidating. "I know," Eliza looked at her steadily, "but you're Tommy Harlan's mother, and you were there, and you know what's true. Margaret Caldwell can be intimidating to people who aren't sure of their facts." "You are sure of yours." A long pause. Tommy looked up from his bread. "Mom should go," he said with complete uncomplicated 8-year-old conviction. "Mrs. Whitmore made me better." Clara looked at her son. Then she looked at Eliza. "All right," she said. It was another 2 hours before Eliza knew what happened at Margaret's house. She spent those hours at home, working in the kitchen, moving through the familiar rhythm of sorting and drying and preparing, her hands occupied while her mind did the harder work of waiting. Thomas came in from the property twice, read her face, and each time left without asking questions, which was one of the things she appreciated most about him in the specific moments when she needed silence. It was Jamie Whitfield who brought the news, as Jamie had been bringing most of the news that week. Arriving at her door in the late afternoon, with the energy of a 14-year-old, who had been given more responsibility than he'd expected and had risen to every bit of it. Mrs. Caldwell went to the Harlan house herself after Clara left, Jamie said. Grandfather said she was there for an hour. Eliza straightened. She saw Tommy, and Jamie grinned. It was the grin of a 14-year-old who understood exactly how significant what he was about to say was. Grandfather says Mrs. Caldwell came to see him this afternoon. She wants to know if there's still room in Wednesday's group. The kitchen was very quiet. Eliza set down what she was holding. She stood there for a moment with the afternoon light coming through the window and the weight of the last 2 weeks pressing against the backs of her eyes in a way she was not going to become anything visible in front of a 14-year-old boy. "Tell your grandfather," she said, when she trusted her voice again, "that there is room." Jamie nodded. He started toward the door, then he stopped. "Mrs. Whitmore?" "Yes." He turned back. He was 14, and in the way of 14-year-olds he was trying to say something and wasn't entirely sure of the shape of it yet. "I told some of my friends what you've been teaching me. About the plants and how to identify them. They thought it was actually kind of interesting." He paused. "Could they come sometime too?" Eliza looked at him. "Yes," she said, "they can come." He left. Thomas came in from outside maybe 10 minutes later to find Eliza standing at the kitchen window with her hands flat on the counter, not working, just standing there. He stopped. "What happened?" he said. "Margaret Caldwell is coming Wednesday," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she turned to look at him. "And Jamie Whitfield's friends want to come," she said. "And I think—"
She stopped. "What?"
"I think it might be growing," she said. "Past what I can manage alone." He held her gaze. "Then don't manage it alone," he said. It was such a simple thing to say, such an ordinary, straightforward thing. And yet it landed in her the way simple, true things land when you've been doing something alone for so long that the alternative has stopped feeling real. "I might need you," she said. "I know." He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her. "Eliza, I have been a slow learner about this, about what you do and what it means. I know that, but I am here now." He paused. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, somewhere across the settlement, a door opened and a woman called her children in for supper. And the ordinary evening sounds of Willow Creek moved around the house the way they always had, the same sounds they had been making, before the Beatles, before the meeting, before everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks. But the people making those sounds were not entirely the same people anymore. And neither was Thomas Whitaker, and neither, in a way she was only beginning to understand, was Eliza. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of stillness that felt earned rather than given. Eliza was at the creek bank 20 minutes before 7. She always arrived early, not from anxiety, but from habit. The same habit that had brought her here every morning for 6 years, before anyone else thought it mattered. She walked the familiar stretch slowly, checking what had come in overnight, noting the conditions, reading the land the way she read everything, carefully, without rushing to conclusions. She heard them before she saw them, footsteps on the path. More than one set, then voices, low and a little uncertain, the sound of people navigating something unfamiliar together. She turned. There were 14 of them. She had expected 8, maybe 9, if everyone who said they were coming actually came. 14 was not 8. 14 was a statement, even if none of them had intended it to be one. Sarah Miller, Ruth Pruitt, Dorothy Hatch, Jamie Whitfield with 2 boys his own age who were trying to look casual about being there. 3 women she recognized from the outer edge of Margaret's social circle, which meant something significant about the information that had been traveling through that network since Monday. The Henderson's daughter, who was 17 and had come alone, which took a kind of quiet courage that Eliza recognized immediately. And Margaret Caldwell, standing slightly apart from the group, in practical boots as instructed, with a small notebook in her hand that she had clearly brought herself without being asked, because Margaret Caldwell was the kind of woman who, once she decided to do something, did it completely or not at all. Their eyes met. Eliza held the look for just a moment, not coldly, not warmly, just steadily, one woman acknowledging another across the complicated space of everything that had passed between them. Then Eliza turned to the whole group and said, "Good morning. Let's start." She taught for 3 hours. She taught the way she always taught, from the ground up, practically, without condescension, starting with identification and moving through preparation and storage and seasonal variation. She asked questions as much as she answered them. She crouched beside plants and gestured at specific features and made people smell things and touch things and describe what they noticed, because knowledge that lived only in the ears didn't survive a winter. But knowledge that had passed through the hands stayed. Margaret Caldwell, she noticed, wrote everything down. Every single thing. Her handwriting was small and precise, and she asked 3 questions during the morning, each one sharp and specific, the questions of a person who was genuinely paying attention, rather than performing attention. By the 3rd question, Eliza found herself answering with the same directness she used with Jamie, without any of the social scaffolding that usually had to be constructed around interactions with Margaret. That was something. That was actually something real. Halfway through the morning, Ruth Pruitt found a plant she couldn't identify and brought it to Eliza. "This one," Ruth said, holding it out. "I've seen it everywhere." "I always thought it was a weed." Eliza looked at it. "Purslane, one of the most nutrient-dense plants on this bank. More iron than spinach." She paused. "Your husband's family has probably been stepping over it for 20 years. Ruth looked at the plant in her hand, with an expression that Eliza recognized, the specific recalibration of a person realizing that something they had been dismissing had value they couldn't see because they had never been taught to look. "Can I take some home?" "Take all you want," Eliza said. "There's more than you could carry." From the corner of her eye, she saw Margaret write something in her notebook. By the time the group dispersed, something had shifted in the texture of the morning that Eliza could feel but not quite name. It was something like possibility, the early-stage version of it, fragile and specific, the kind that could still be damaged by a single bad afternoon. But it was there. Jamie and his friends lingered last. Jamie's 2 friends, boys named Will and Patrick, who were trying hard to seem unimpressed while clearly being impressed, had spent most of the morning competing quietly to identify plants correctly, which Eliza found genuinely charming. "Same time Friday," Jamie said. "Same time Friday," she said. They left, and then it was just Eliza and Margaret. Margaret was still standing near the water, looking at a cluster of watercress with her notebook open, finishing a note. She looked up when she realized the others were gone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I owe you an explanation," Margaret said. "You don't owe me anything, I do." Margaret closed the notebook. Her voice was controlled, but there was something working underneath it, the effortful quality of a person saying something they have practiced and are now discovering is harder to say in person than it was in the rehearsal. "When I heard about the Harlan boy, I should have gone to you directly, instead of what I did." She paused. "Which was nothing. I did nothing. And in a community this size, doing nothing is the same as choosing a side." Eliza looked at her. "Why did you come Wednesday?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Because Clara Harlan came to my house and told me what actually happened, and I looked at her face while she was telling me, and I knew it was true." Another pause. "And because I went to see Tommy, and he told me you'd promised to teach him the difference between crow garlic and wild garlic when he was well." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. Very briefly, he said it like it was the thing he was most looking forward to. Eliza absorbed that. "He's a smart boy," she said. "He is." Margaret looked at the creek for a moment. "I've been wrong about you, Mrs. Whitmore. I've been specifically and consistently wrong, and I compounded it by using my position in this community to make other people comfortable being wrong alongside me." She met Eliza's eyes. "That's not a small thing." "No," Eliza agreed, "it's not. I'm not asking you to forgive it immediately." "I'm not forgiving it immediately," Eliza said honestly. "But I'm not holding it as a debt either. I don't have the energy for that." She picked up her basket. "What I want, Margaret, is for you to use that same position to make people comfortable being right. That would be the useful thing." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "I can do that," she said quietly. "I know you can," Eliza said. "That's why I said it." She turned and walked up the bank. Behind her, she heard Margaret follow. The next 4 days were the fastest of the entire summer. Word moved through Willow Creek, the way word moves in a small settlement, when it has somewhere it wants to go, not in a straight line, but in the particular branching pattern of conversation. One person telling two, those two each telling two more. The information mutating slightly at each transmission, but retaining its essential shape. The essential shape this time was, Eliza Whitmore knows things and is teaching them, and the people learning are doing better. Thomas felt it from the outside in. He was at Henson's store on Thursday morning, picking up a part for a fence repair when Robert Henson said, casually, between transactions, "Your wife's doing a good thing," not with any great fanfare. Just stated it the way Robert stated things, as a practical fact of the environment. Thomas came home and told Eliza. She was at the counter, sorting dried plants, and she didn't stop what she was doing. But she went still for a moment in a way that was different from her usual stillness. Robert Henson said that, she said, to my face in his store in front of two other men. She went back to sorting. Thomas watched her hands for a moment. How are you doing, he asked, not the automatic version of the question. The real one. She thought about it. Tired, good tired, or bad tired? I don't know yet. She looked up. The group is getting bigger. I'm going to run out of morning if it keeps growing. She paused. I've been thinking about a different structure. Smaller groups rotating so I can go deeper with each one. But that means more organization, more tracking. And I'm already... I can handle the organization, Thomas said. She looked at him. You're already handling the teaching, he said simply. Let me handle what goes around it. The schedules, the communication, making sure people know when and where. I'm good at structure, he almost smiled, even if I've been applying it to the wrong things. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said. That was how Thomas Whitaker became, quietly and without announcement, the person who kept the growing operation running while his wife did what only she could do. He organized 3 rotating groups of 8, scheduled morning sessions, through the end of summer, and began making a list of everything that needed to happen before the first frost, what to preserve, how much, in what form, which families still had the least and needed priority attention. He did it with the same methodical competence he brought to everything on the farm. He did it without needing to be thanked or noticed. And he did it, Eliza thought, watching him work at the table one evening with his papers spread around him, like a man who had found the way to contribute to something he should have been contributing to all along, and was making up for lost time. She didn't say that out loud, but she thought it. The twist came on Saturday. It came in the form of a letter delivered by the county courier just after noon, addressed to Eliza Whitmore in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it at the kitchen table with Thomas sitting across from her. The letter was from a man named Dr. Clarence Webb, a physician based in Hartfield, the county seat, who wrote that he had heard about the situation in Willow Creek through his colleague, Dr. Ames, who had been called to see several families during the crisis. He wrote that he had a particular interest in botanical medicine and the practical applications of native plants in rural health, and that he had been attempting to compile information on this subject for some years. He had heard, he wrote, that there was a woman in Willow Creek with unusual practical expertise in this area, and he wondered if she would be willing to correspond with him, or, if she was amenable, to meet at some mutually convenient time. Eliza read the letter twice. She set it down on the table. Thomas had been watching her face. What is it? She slid the letter across to him. He read it. His expression changed as he read, not dramatically, but she could track the movement through it, the processing, the arrival at the same place she had just arrived. He set the letter down. A doctor, yes, a doctor in Hartfield wants to talk to you about plants. Apparently. Thomas looked at the letter again, then back at her. Eliza. This he stopped. I know, she said again. He picked the letter back up and read it a third time, the way Thomas read things when he was making sure he understood them correctly, not moving on until he did. He's asking you to correspond, to share your knowledge with a medical professional. He set it down. You know what that means. It means someone outside Willow Creek knows what I know has value. It means, Thomas's voice had something in it she had never heard there before, Or maybe she had heard it and hadn't known what to call it until now. It was something close to pride, not the defensive kind, not the reflexive kind. The real kind, the kind that comes from understanding the full weight of a thing. It means you were right, not just about the Beatles. About all of it. Eliza sat with that for a moment. She had spent so long preparing to defend herself that being told she was right completely and externally, and with documentation, produced something complicated rather than simple. It should have felt like victory. It felt more like a door she had been pressing against for years suddenly opening when she had stopped, expecting it to move. "I'm going to write back," she said. "Obviously you're going to write back." She almost laughed. "I just want to say it out loud." "Say it as many times as you want." He folded the letter carefully and slid it back to her side of the table. "And then write back." She wrote that afternoon. She wrote 3 drafts, which was not like her. She was normally decisive with words, but this mattered in a way that made her careful. She wrote plainly and precisely about what she knew and how she had come to know it. She mentioned her grandmother's influence and the 6 years of careful observation and the notebook on the shelf. She included 2 specific plant descriptions from memory as a demonstration of the depth of what she had documented. She sent it with the Sunday Courier. She didn't tell anyone about the letter except Thomas. Not yet. Not until she knew what it meant. Not until she had something solid to hold rather than a possibility that could still disappear. But she walked the creek Monday morning with something different in her step. Not triumph, something quieter than that. The feeling of a person who has been walking in a direction for a very long time without being certain the direction was right, and has just found a landmark that confirms yes, this way, keep going. The following Wednesday session had 17 people. Margaret Caldwell arrived first. That fact did not go unnoticed by anyone who arrived after her, which Eliza suspected was not entirely accidental. Margaret had a gift for the strategic placement of herself that she had apparently decided to deploy in a new direction. Ruth Pruitt leaned close to Eliza before the session started and said quietly, she told 3 women at the church auxiliary that this was the most practical knowledge they could acquire this season. Direct quote, according to Dorothy. Eliza looked at Margaret, who was standing with her notebook ready and her expression composed, and thought about the particular power of a person who had once been your adversary becoming something else. Good, Eliza said. The session that morning was the deepest one yet. She took the group through food preservation, what to dry, what to salt, what could be stored in the root cellar in what form, how to identify when stored food was still safe and when it had turned. It was less dramatic than plant identification in the field. It was also, she told them, more important, because knowing what you could eat in August didn't help you in February if you didn't know how to make it last. People leaned in. Margaret asked 4 questions, all of them good. Halfway through the morning, something happened that Eliza hadn't anticipated. One of the younger women, a girl named Nora, barely 20, married to a farmer on the north edge of the settlement, someone Eliza had barely spoken to before the crisis raised her hand. "Mrs. Whitmore," Nora said, "my mother-in-law is sick." "Not like Tommy Harlan sick. She's been sick for a long time. Something with her joints. The doctor in Hartfield said there wasn't much he could do. She's in a lot of pain most mornings." She paused. "Dorothy told me about the thing you gave her for her rheumatism." I wondered if Eliza held up a hand gently. "Tell me more about what she's experiencing." Nora described it carefully, the joint pain, the pattern of it, worse in the mornings, slightly better by afternoon, the swelling in the knuckles, how long it had been going on. Eliza listened with her full attention. "I want to be clear," she said when Nora finished. "I'm not a doctor. What I know is plants and their practical uses, and some of that overlaps with what can help with pain and inflammation, but I'm not going to tell you it cures anything. What I can tell you is what I'd try, and you can decide if you want to bring it to her." "Please," Nora said, Eliza explained. Yellow root tincture which her grandmother had used for joint inflammation. Specific preparation, specific dosage, and importantly, what not to combine it with, and the signs that it wasn't agreeing with someone's system. The group was very quiet while she talked. When she finished, Dorothy Hatch said, "From the back of the group, she's had me on something similar for 6 months. My hands are better than they've been in 10 years." Everyone turned to look at Dorothy. Dorothy shrugged, entirely unbothered. "I told you she knew what she was doing. Some of us were paying attention." The laughter that moved through the group was real, not polite, not performative, but genuine, the kind that comes when tension has been held for a long time and suddenly has somewhere to go. Even Margaret smiled. It was a small smile, contained the Margaret Caldwell version of a smile. But it was there. That afternoon, Thomas came in from outside with a look on his face that Eliza had learned to read by now as, "Something has happened, and I'm deciding how to tell you." She set down what she was doing. "What is it?" "Cal Pruitt came by while you were at the creek." And Thomas sat down. "He wants to apologize, formally. He says he's been trying to figure out how to do it, and he keeps getting it wrong in his head, and he asked me if there was a right way." He looked at her. "I told him I'd ask you." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Cal Pruitt, who had told people she had charged for food she gave freely. Cal Pruitt, whose pride had turned into a rumor that had nearly undone everything she was trying to build. Cal Pruitt, whose wife was now one of the sharpest learners in the Wednesday group, and whose apology on the store step had been the most effortful, honest thing she had seen a man do in years. "Tell him to come for supper," she said. Thomas blinked. "Supper. Yes, you're going to feed the man who spread lies about you." "I'm going to feed a man who was frightened and ashamed and made a mistake he's been carrying since." She went back to the counter. "And his wife, because Ruth deserves a decent meal and a night where her husband is being his better self." She paused. "And because the food is going to be made from creek plants, and he's going to have to eat it and admit it's good. Which is, honestly, the part I'm most looking forward to." Thomas stared at her for a moment. Then he put on his hat and went to deliver the invitation. The Pruitts arrived at 6. Cal came through the door with the stiff posture of a man who has decided to face something and is still not entirely sure he can do it. Ruth came in behind him with a jar of preserves she had clearly brought, because she hadn't known what else to bring and had decided something was better than nothing. Eliza took the preserves. "Thank you, Ruth. It's not much," Ruth said. "It's from your pantry during a hard summer," Eliza said. "It's more than enough." They sat at the table. Eliza served the same kind of meal she always made, now clean, practical, fragrant, made from things that grew without anyone's permission in the land around Willow Creek. A soup with wild garlic and lamb's quarters. A salad of watercress and purslane with something tart and bright that came from the wood sorrel she had been drying all week. Cal Pruitt looked at his plate. He looked at it for long enough that the silence became notable. Then he picked up his spoon. He tasted the soup. He set the spoon down. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and his voice had the texture of a man removing something he had been wearing too long. "I said something that wasn't true, and I said it to people, and it caused you damage I can't fully measure. I can't undo it, but I'm telling you directly in your house at your table I'm sorry." He paused. "That's all I've got. I'm just sorry." Eliza looked at him across the table. She let the words sit for a moment, not to make him uncomfortable, or not only for that, but because she had learned that accepting an apology too quickly sometimes cheapened it, turned it into a transaction rather than a reckoning. "I accept that," she said, "and I need you to do one more thing." He met her eyes. "Name it. The people you told, the ones who heard the wrong version from you, I need you to tell them the right version. Not because it helps me specifically, though it does, but because those people are going to carry the wrong version into the winter if no one corrects it, and they're going to make decisions based on it, and some of those decisions are going to hurt their families." She held his gaze. "You have enough standing in this settlement that people will believe you when you correct it. So correct it." Cal was quiet. "That's a harder thing than apologizing to you," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking for it." Another silence. Ruth beside him put her hand briefly on his arm. He looked at his wife. Something passed between them that was private and real, and had been built from whatever the past weeks had required of them together. He looked back at Eliza. "All right," he said. "Good." She picked up the bread and offered it across the table. Now eat. Ruth worked hard on those preserves, and we're not going to waste the evening on more apologizing when there's food on the table." Ruth laughed, genuinely fully, the laugh of a woman who has been holding too much for too long and has just been given permission to put it down. Cal looked at the bread in his hand. He took a bite. He chewed. He was quiet for a moment. "This is good," he said, with the particular reluctant honesty of a man admitting something he would rather not admit. "Of course it is," Eliza said, and she picked up her own spoon and started eating, and the supper went forward. Later, when the Pruitts had gone and the house was quiet, and Thomas was washing dishes with the methodical thoroughness he brought to everything, Eliza sat at the table with the letter from Dr. Webb in front of her. She had taken it out again without quite deciding to. She was just looking at it. Thomas dried his hands. Came and sat across from her. "Thinking about the doctor?" he asked. "Thinking about all of it," she said. He looked at the letter. "What does it mean? Long term, if he writes back, if this turns into something real?" She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything. "It means that what I know doesn't have to stay in Willow Creek," she said slowly. "It means it could go further, get documented properly. Be useful to people who are dealing with the same shortages, the same failures, the same situations in communities that don't have someone who's been walking their creek for 6 years. She paused. "My grandmother learned from a woman in Pennsylvania who learned from someone before her. That knowledge traveled. It was passed." She looked at the letter. "Maybe this is the next version of that. Something more formal. Something that lasts." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother would have something to say about this," he said. "She'd say about time," Eliza said. He almost smiled. "That sounds about right." She folded the letter. She put it back in the place on the shelf where she kept things that mattered. And then she looked at Thomas across the table, her husband. The man who had taken years to see what she was doing and had spent the last 3 weeks making up for it with every ounce of the competence and reliability that had always been in him. And she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for longer than she could precisely say. Not finished, not done. Things were not finished or done. There was still the winter to get through, still families to reach, still knowledge to share, still the reply from Dr. Webb that may or may not come, still the 100 ordinary difficulties of a community in recovery that would require 100 ordinary acts of persistence to move through. But something essential had changed. The land was the same. The creek was the same. But Willow Creek was not the same place it had been the morning the Beatles came. And Eliza Whitmore, who had walked its edges alone for 6 years while people laughed, was not doing it alone anymore. And that, she thought, was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all. Dr. Webb's reply came 11 days later. Eliza was at the creek when Thomas found her, and she knew from the way he was walking not fast exactly, but with a specific kind of directed energy that was different from his usual morning pace, that something had arrived. He held the letter out without a word. She dried her hands on her apron and took it. She read it standing on the bank with the water moving beside her, and Thomas watching her face, the way he had learned to watch her face when something was being decided inside her that hadn't surfaced yet into words. Dr. Clarence Webb wrote back at twice the length she had written him. He wrote that her letter was the most practically detailed account of native plant application he had received from any source, professional or otherwise. He wrote that the 2 plant descriptions she had included were accurate to a degree that he could only attribute to years of direct, methodical observation. He wrote that he had shared her letter with her permission sought retroactively, he acknowledged, which he apologized for, with a colleague at the Kansas State Agricultural Board, a man named Dr. Harlan Foster, who had responded with considerable interest. He wrote that Dr. Foster would like to meet her, not correspond. Meet in person at her convenience in Willow Creek or wherever she preferred. He wrote one more thing at the end, in slightly different handwriting, as if he had added it after setting the letter down and then picking it up again. He wrote, "Mrs. Whitmore, in 20 years of practice, I have met 3 people who understood plants the way you appear to understand them. Two of them had formal training that took a decade to acquire. You appear to have arrived at the same place through observation and inheritance. That is not a common thing. I hope you understand that. Eliza stood on the creek bank and read that last paragraph 3 times. Then she folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest for just a moment with her eyes closed. Thomas waited. "Well," he said, when he couldn't wait anymore. She opened her eyes. "They want to meet me." "I heard you reading," he said. "Who's Dr. Foster?" "Kansas State Agricultural Board." Thomas went very still. "That's not a small thing." "No," she said, "it's not, Eliza." His voice had something in it that was almost undone. "Do you understand what's happening?" "I'm trying to," she said honestly. He took 2 steps toward her and put both hands on her face, which was so unlike Thomas Whitaker, who expressed everything through actions and proximity, and almost never through gestures this direct, that it startled her into looking straight at him. "You were right," he said. "About everything. About the land, about the plants, about what you were building all these years. All of it." His jaw was tight, and I was one of the people who didn't see it. "I need you to know that I know that." She put her hands over his. "I know you know it," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." "I know." She held his gaze. "Thomas, it matters. What you just said, it matters." He nodded once, rough and quick, the way he nodded when something was costing him to hold together. She stepped back, picked up her basket, put the letter inside carefully, against the flat side of the basket where it wouldn't crease. "I'm going to write back today," she said. "I'm going to say yes." "Good. And I'm going to need you to help me figure out how to get to Hartfield without leaving the Wednesday and Friday groups without anyone." He had already been thinking about this. She could see it. "I'll run the sessions while you're gone. I know enough now to do the basic identification work. Anything technical they can wait for you to come back for." She looked at him. "You know enough," she repeated, not quite a question. "I've been paying attention," he said, with a slight defensiveness that was entirely Thomas and entirely endearing. "I'm not you, but I know enough." She turned up the bank toward home. "Come on then," she said. "Help me write the letter." She wrote it at the kitchen table, Thomas sitting across from her, both of them working through the language until it said what it needed to say, neither deferential nor overconfident. Simply direct and clear, the way Eliza said everything that mattered. She confirmed the meeting and proposed a date 3 weeks out, which would give her time to organize the Lex Willow Creek sessions around her absence and prepare what she needed to bring. What she needed to bring, she had decided, was the notebook. The 6-year notebook, all of it. That evening she sat with it for 2 hours, going through every entry, and Thomas sat nearby not talking, which was exactly what she needed. She read her own handwriting from 6 years ago, careful, young, slightly different from how she wrote now. Recording the first plants she had identified on the south bank with the precision her grandmother had taught her, and she felt the weight of time in a way she rarely allowed herself to. 6 years, every morning, before the sun was fully up, before the community she lived in had decided what it thought of her for that day, before Thomas woke, before anyone needed anything from her. 6 years of showing up at the edge of the world and paying attention to what was there. It had not felt like building something. It had just felt like the thing she knew how to do. She closed the notebook and looked at it sitting on the table and thought about her grandmother Marin, who had died when Eliza was 16 and had not lived to see any of this, and who had never needed to see it to know it was worth doing. "The knowledge is the point," Marin used to say, "not what people do with it. The knowing itself is the point." But Eliza had come to believe, slowly and at some cost, that the knowing was only the first part. The second part was the giving away, the teaching. The passing of the hand over the next hand in the dirt. That was the part her grandmother had also done, and had perhaps not given herself sufficient credit for. She went to bed with the notebook on the shelf and slept better than she had in weeks. The next morning changed everything again, and it did it quietly, the way the most significant things tend to do. She was at the creek at her usual time, alone as she was always alone in this first hour before the morning sessions, when she heard footsteps she didn't recognize. Not Thomas, not Jamie, someone heavier, slower with a cane. She turned. Samuel Whitfield was making his way down the bank path. Alone, without Jamie, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who had decided to go somewhere his body was only partially cooperating with, and had resolved not to let that stop him. Eliza moved toward him immediately. "Mr. Whitfield." "You should have sent Jamie." "I know," he said, accepting her steadying hand on his arm without ceremony. "I didn't want Jamie. I wanted to walk this myself." She walked beside him slowly, matching his pace, saying nothing. He looked at the creek. He looked at the plants on the bank. He moved his eyes over everything with the observation of a man who had been farming this valley for 50 years and was seeing it differently than he had the last time he looked. "My wife used to say," he said after a while, "that the land was more patient than people gave it credit for. That it would outlast all the mistakes we made on it and just keep offering what it had, as long as someone bothered to see it." He paused. "I used to think that was something she said, because she was kind. I'm beginning to think she was just accurate." Eliza held her tongue. "I've been watching you for 3 years from my window," Samuel said. "Morning after morning. I thought, and I'm ashamed to tell you what I thought, but I'll tell you anyway. Because I'm old enough to owe people the truth, I thought you were a woman who couldn't face an empty house, and so she filled her time with wandering." He stopped walking. "Looked at her directly. I was wrong." "Yes," Eliza said, because he deserved the honesty of that. "I was wrong in a way that has consequences," he said. "Because when I am wrong about something in this settlement, the people who look to me for their judgments tend to be wrong in this direction." He held her gaze. "What you said at the town meeting, about knowledge only mattering when it helps someone else. I've been thinking about that every day since." She waited. "I want to record it," he said. "What you know, more formally than the notebook you showed me. I want to write it down in a way that can be submitted to the county, to the agricultural board, to wherever it needs to go so that it belongs to more than one place." He paused. "I have some standing with the county. I've been farming this land longer than anyone else in this valley. If I put my name on a document that says Eliza Whitmore's knowledge is valid and practically tested, people who would dismiss you will have a harder time dismissing it." Eliza stared at him. "That's a significant thing to offer," she said carefully. "I know, I'm offering it." She was quiet for a moment. The creek moved beside them. She thought about what this meant not just for her, but for what she was trying to pass forward. She thought about Dr. Foster and the agricultural board and the letter on her kitchen shelf. She thought about the Wednesday group, which now had 22 people and kept growing, and the Friday group, which was newer and younger, and had a different energy that she was only beginning to understand how to teach to. She thought about her grandmother's hands over hers in the dirt and the thing that had been moving forward since then. "Yes," she said, "I'd be grateful." Samuel nodded once. He looked at the creek for another moment. "My wife would have liked you," he said. "I would have liked her," Eliza said. They walked back up the bank together, slowly. The old man and the woman everyone had called foolish, and neither of them said anything else, because everything that needed to be said had been. The meeting with Dr. Foster happened on a Tuesday in early September. Thomas drove her to Hartfield in the wagon, with the notebook packed carefully in a cloth bag beside her medical kit and the basket she had filled that morning, more out of habit than necessity. They left before dawn and arrived mid-morning, which gave her time to compose herself before the meeting, which she needed, because the composure she projected was real, but it was not effortless. And no one had ever seen how much work went into making it look like the effortless kind. Dr. Foster was younger than she expected. 40, perhaps, with a straightforward manner and the particular quality of attention that indicated a person who had learned to listen as a professional skill and had gotten genuinely good at it. He stood when she came in, which she noted. He had her letter on the desk in front of him, and Samuel Whitfield's accompanying letter beside it, and he had clearly read both of them more than once, because they had the slightly soft edges of papers that have been handled repeatedly. He asked her questions for 2 hours, not testing questions or not only testing questions. Questions of genuine inquiry, following her answers into the next question the way a person follows a thread, wanting to understand the whole shape of the thing rather than just the piece directly in front of them. He asked about her grandmother's training, about the specific conditions of the creek bank and the eastern fields, about the beetle pattern and what she had observed leading up to it, about the preparation methods she used for storage and how they compared to standard preservation techniques. She answered everything completely. At one point, she took the notebook out of the cloth bag and put it on the desk, open to the entry from 3 years ago that documented the first significant pattern she had identified in the plant population along the south bank. Dr. Foster looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. He looked up at her. "How long did you keep this without anyone taking it seriously?" 6 years, she said. He held her gaze. "I'm sorry for that." "You weren't there," she said. "No. But the systems I'm part of are part of why women like you don't get listened to." He said it flatly, without drama, as a statement of fact he had arrived at through experience and was willing to say out loud. "That's worth acknowledging." She looked at him steadily. "It is," she agreed. "And what would be worth even more is making sure the next woman doesn't have to wait 6 years." Something in his expression shifted. "That's what I'd like to talk about," he said. "If you're willing." She was willing. What came out of that conversation, over the next hour, was something she had not allowed herself to imagine before arriving, because imagining things that might not happen had always seemed like a way of making their absence more painful. Dr. Foster wanted to formally document her work as part of a county-wide botanical knowledge initiative he was attempting to establish. He wanted her name on it, her methodology, her 6 years of data. He wanted to bring her to speak at a meeting of the Kansas Farming Association in October, where 3 counties would be represented. He wanted to pay her. Not much, he was honest about that. The budget was limited and the initiative was new, and not everyone at the Agricultural Board was convinced of its value yet. But something, an official something, for official knowledge in a formal setting. She sat across from that possibility for a moment. She thought about standing in her kitchen 6 years ago, the first morning she had brought home water. Thomas had looked at it without knowing what it was. She thought about the Caldwell supper table and the sound of Margaret's dismissive laugh. She thought about standing on the creek bank alone in the cold pre-dawn, telling herself that the knowledge was the point, the knowing was the point, because she had needed to believe that in order to keep going. She had believed it. She still believed it, but she was also allowed to receive the thing that was being offered without diminishing what it meant. "Yes," she said, "I'll do it." Thomas was waiting outside with the wagon. He looked up when she came out. He read her face. He did not say anything, just moved over on the seat to make room, which was his way of asking, "Tell me everything." She climbed up beside him. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was the way Thomas listened to important things. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment, and the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that meant both people were inside the same weight of something, and were holding it together. "October," he said finally, "the Farming Association." "Yes, 3 counties. Yes," he picked up the reins. He was quiet for another moment. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "What?" "That first morning. When you came home from the creek and you tried to tell me about the birds moving east and the beetles, and He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I told you I didn't have time to chase every worry." The road opened up ahead of them. The September air was beginning to carry the first edges of fall in it, the first suggestion of change. "Thomas," she said, "I know you've forgiven it, I know that." "I was going to say," she said, "that if you hadn't said that, I might have relied on you to convince people instead of finding the way to do it myself. And then the Wednesday group would have been built on your credibility instead of mine. And Dr. Foster would have written to you and not to me, and everything that's happening would be happening to someone else." She looked at the road ahead. "I'm not grateful you doubted me, but I am who I am partly because of what I had to build alone." He was quiet for a long time. "That's a more generous interpretation than I deserve," he said. "Probably," she agreed. He glanced at her sideways. She was almost smiling. He faced the road again. "You're going to be difficult to live with after that speech in October." "I've always been difficult to live with." "Fair enough," he said. And he was almost smiling, too. They drove home through the September afternoon, and Willow Creek came into view eventually, the way it always did, the familiar shape of the settlement. The fields recovering in their slow, particular way, the creek visible in the distance from the road. October came faster than Eliza expected. The weeks between the Hartfield meeting and the Farming Association speech moved the way busy weeks do. Lenfrig's of Wednesday session that had grown to 26 people and required her to speak louder than she was accustomed to. A Friday session where Nora's mother-in-law came for the first time and stood quietly at the edge of the group and watched with the careful attention of a woman who has been in pain long enough to take nothing for granted. A letter from Dr. Webb saying he looked forward to her presentation. A visit from Jamie Whitfield, who had been studying her notebook with Samuel's blessing, and who asked her, in the careful way of a 14-year-old carrying something large, whether she thought he might one day know enough to teach this himself. She had looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I think that's exactly what you're going to do." He had tried not to show how much that meant. He hadn't entirely succeeded. Thomas organized the wagon for the October trip with the particular thoroughness he brought to everything, now not the thoroughness of a man managing logistics, but the thoroughness of a man who understood what this was and wanted to make sure nothing prevented it from going exactly as it needed to go. The night before they left, Eliza sat at the kitchen table with her notes for the speech in front of her. She had written it 3 times. The first version was too defensive, unconsciously building the case for why she should be believed, which was the wrong starting point, and which she recognized as the residue of 6 years of not being believed. The second version was too technical, correct in every detail but bloodless, the kind of thing a person read and respected without feeling. The third version she had written in one sitting, late at night when Thomas was asleep, in the same quiet pre-dawn energy she brought to the creek every morning. She had written it the way she walked the bank, not toward a destination but in the act of paying attention, one word following the next, the way one step followed another on familiar ground. She read it one final time. It was about observation. About what happens when you stop demanding that the world provide what you expect and start seeing what it actually offers. It was about her grandmother's hands. It was about 6 years of mornings that nobody witnessed and the knowledge those mornings built. It was about a beetle disaster in a Kansas valley and the families who survived it because one woman had been paying attention when everyone else was looking somewhere else. It was not about being right. It was about what paying attention costs and what it gives back and why the giving back is worth the cost even when nobody is watching. She folded it, put it in the cloth bag with the notebook. Thomas was standing in the doorway. She hadn't heard him get up. "Come to bed," he said quietly. "You know it. You don't need to read it again." She looked at the bag on the table. "What if they don't?" "They're going to listen," he said. "And even if some of them don't, the ones who do are going to take it somewhere. You told me that yourself." He moved into the room and put his hand on her shoulder. "Come to bed, Eliza." She let him lead her away from the table. She slept. The hall in Hartfield was fuller than she had expected. Farmers, wives, county officials, a handful of men she recognized as the kind of men who came to these things to be seen taking them seriously, without necessarily taking them seriously. Dr. Foster was there, and Dr. Webb, and Samuel Whitfield had come, which she had not expected, and which moved her more than she could manage without effort. Thomas sat in the second row. She stood at the front of the room and looked at all of them. She thought about the Caldwell supper table, the sound of laughter aimed at her. The years of mornings alone on the bank, alone with the creek and the plants and the accumulated knowing of her grandmother's grandmother's grandmother. All of it carried forward in her hands. She thought about Sarah Miller's face when she handed her the basket. She thought about Tommy Harlan saying still alive. She thought about Margaret Caldwell arriving first at the creek with her notebook already open. She thought about Thomas standing in the kitchen that first morning, saying, "Come to bed. I don't have time to chase every worry," and she thought about him standing in the same kitchen weeks later, saying, "Let me help. Tell me what you need. I'm here." She thought about what it meant to see something no one else was seeing. The loneliness of it, the cost of it, and the thing that cost could build. If you let it, if you kept going, if you trusted the knowing even when no one else did. She stood very still at the front of the room. Then she began. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not rush. She did not soften anything that needed to be sharp, and she did not sharpen anything that needed to be quiet. She said what she knew the way she taught what she knew from the ground up, practically, starting with the earth and moving toward the people. By the time she finished, the room was very still. Then it wasn't. The response was not unanimous. It never was. She had stopped expecting unanimity somewhere around the second week of Wednesday sessions. There were men in the back whose faces said they were still deciding, and there were men near the front whose faces said they had already decided, but didn't want to say it in public. And there were women throughout the room whose faces said they had known something like this all along and were relieved to hear someone say it from a stage. But there were also people standing, not all of them. But enough that it was real and not polite. Samuel Whitfield stood up from his seat and put his hat to his chest, which from Samuel was the kind of gesture a man makes when he is putting his full name behind something. Dr. Foster caught her eye from the side of the room and nodded once, with the expression of a person who had hoped for a specific outcome and was looking at it. Thomas. Thomas was sitting in the second row, and he was not standing. She would find out later that this was because he had been gripping the back of the chair in front of him with both hands from somewhere around the midpoint of the speech, and hadn't trusted himself to let go. But his face, when she finally let herself look fully at it, was a thing she would carry for the rest of her life. Not pride exactly, or not only pride, something deeper than that. The expression of a man who had looked at something for years without seeing it, and was now seeing it completely, finally, and was sitting with the full weight of both the seeing and the not seeing at once. She held his gaze for just a moment, then she looked back at the room. The applause was still going. She stood in it, quiet and still, with the notebook in her hands, and 6 years of mornings behind her, and the creek moving through Willow Creek the way it always moved. Patient and indifferent and full of everything anyone had ever walked past without stopping to see. The foolish wife who gathered weeds had been right all along. She had always known she was right. Now finally, so did everyone else. And the difference between those two things, between knowing it alone and knowing it together, was not the knowledge itself. It was the morning she stopped walking the bank by herself and started teaching someone else to walk beside her. That was when the knowing became something that could outlast her. That was when it became something that could not be taken away, laughed at, dismissed, or starved out of a settlement by beetles or pride, or 6 years of deliberate silence from people who should have known better. She had planted it in other hands, and it would grow.